Good morning, everyone. Welcome to College Avenue's annual Ladies' Day. We are so grateful that y'all took the time out of your busy schedules to spend part of the day with us. We know that it's Mother's Day weekend, and we want to wish all the mothers here a really happy Mother's Day. I truly believe it's the hardest job in the world, but it is the most rewarding too. Before we get started, I would like for us to go to our Father in prayer. Would y'all pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for all the talented women who worked on this Ladies' Day. We pray this event will shed more light on mental illness, which is so often kept behind closed doors. We pray that the women here will become more equipped to recognize mental illness in themselves or those they love. Help us to know that healing can be found. We pray the sessions today will give us many tools to use for the benefit of our families. We ask you to give Miranda strength and the words to open our eyes and our hearts. We love you, Father, and we know that every good and perfect gift comes from you. Thank you for always holding our hands as we face the difficult parts of life. It is so comforting to know we never walk alone, especially in the dark times. In Jesus' holy name, amen. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank some of the women that worked really hard on this event. Our coordinators were Heather Sexton and Leanne Galloway. Michelle Hudson also did a lot to help with the event. And Nancy Ellis is the one that gave us all of her hats and gloves and shoes that you'll see in the fellowship hall to go along with our theme. And we just want to give them a round of applause for making this possible. It is my special honor to get to introduce our speaker today, because Miranda is my precious daughter. Miranda earned a master's degree in speech-language pathology at the University of Montevallo. Miranda also teaches music and piano and accompanies the Enterprise Entertainers Show Choir. Miranda works alongside her husband, Caleb Cochran, in ministry here at College Avenue. Miranda has been blessed with two beautiful little girls, Aurora and Iris. They were the inspiration for her book, Milk Drunk, Diary of a First-Time Mom. The book is available for purchase today, signed by the author, of course, or it can be ordered on Amazon. The subject, Clothed and in Her Right Mind, is very personal to Miranda because she has dealt with severe chemical depression. Since I am her mother, I spent a lot of time just sitting in the pain with her. I witnessed a beautiful and talented young woman be literally tortured by this horrible disease. Through all the pain and the tears, my greatest comfort was knowing that Miranda would use her suffering to help others, because Miranda has a gift for words. Today's series is the beginning of Miranda's hope to bless others and to use her illness for good. Let's welcome our speaker, Miranda Cochran.
All right, good morning, everybody. I am so honored to get to speak to you ladies about a topic that is so close to my heart and really affects pretty much every aspect of my life. I was kind of thinking we'd have name tags this morning, but we don't. But at a lot of these events, I felt like my name tag ought to say, hello, my name is depression, because I felt like that's all people could see when they looked at me. I've been struggling with major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant major depressive disorder, for the last 2 years, but I feel like I've had that problem for a whole lot longer than my official diagnosis. Throughout this trying season, I prayed to God over and over again that something, anything good, could come from that time of needless suffering. And surely this opportunity to speak to a room full of ladies about mental health is an answer to that prayer. So thank you so much for letting me come speak to you this morning. So the plan for this afternoon and this morning, the first session, I want to give us some hints into the ins and outs of mental illness itself to kind of increase our understanding of what mental illness looks like and how it affects the people around us. In the second session, I want to show us some of the characters in the Bible who very likely suffered from mental illness and talk about some of the encouragement that the Bible has to offer from such suffering. In the third session, I want to help us figure out how we can help others who are suffering with a mental illness. And if you yourself happen to have a mental illness, how you can help yourself as well. And then I wanted to save the last session for a Q&A session. Mental health is such a huge topic that there's no way I could cover absolutely everything. So I wanted to save the last session for any questions you may have regarding the material we covered, regarding any other questions you could have, and we'll spend some time in question and answer. All right, I'm going to try and progress this. Let's see. There we go. All right, so first things first, we want to talk about some statistics on mental health. So mental illness has become a bit of a pandemic unto itself in the United States. About 1 in 5 adults will experience some sort of mental illness in any given year, which is a huge number. 1 in 20 adults will experience severe mental illness such that it affects their ability to function and to go to work. 1 in 6 youth aged 6 to 17 will experience a mental health disorder each year. And suicide is the leading cause of death in people aged 4 to 24. Let's see. All right, perfect. All right, females appear to be at particular risk for mental illness, with women suffering 51.2% of mental illnesses compared to only 37.4% for males. Now, you may notice that math doesn't add up, but the National Alliance on Mental Health also includes a bracket for gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and amongst those populations, 54.3% of mental illnesses are suffered in that group of people. One of the things that makes mental illness so scary is the poor treatment rate we have for mental illness. Of those reported mental illnesses, only 46.2% actually receive any treatment, and that's just for reported mental illness. Millions of cases of undiagnosed mental illness are still out there, so the numbers I reported for you today are probably grossly underestimated. So given those numbers, it is very likely that you or someone you know has been suffering with mental illness. Mental illness falls through the cracks very frequently for lots of different reasons. It is called an invisible illness, and for good reason. Mental illness is not as obvious as something like pneumonia that you can diagnose with a chest x-ray. There's no known blood test that you can take to see, oh yes, you are positive for mental illness. Mental illness often is diagnosed with checklists that you have to self-report. So it's not like a doctor is going to approach you about mental illness. This is something you have to recognize in yourself and then come forward to get treatment for. Sometimes family prodding will help you get treatment. But yeah, so mental illness falls through the cracks because it's so invisible. You would think it would be very obvious to the person suffering with mental illness, but that they have one. But mental illness likes to masquerade as so many other things. For example, it's just too easy to brush off signs of mental unrest for other things. For one thing, one of the severe symptoms of depression is this extreme fatigue that you get. It's almost like pregnant tired, or the tired you have when you've had a flu and you're just exhausted. But when I was a new mother, I assumed that my extreme fatigue was just because I had a waking newborn that had her days and nights mixed up. And I assumed that my lack of luster for life was just because I had 2 children under 2 and I was very isolated and I couldn't get out. But looking back, I know now that I had postpartum depression, and what's worse, I never sought any treatment for it because I didn't recognize it. In fact, from my book, I'm going to read just one or two entries about my time with postpartum depression so you can kind of get an insight into where my mind was at the time. And this was in the year 2018. I said, "Dear girls, I think I may be struggling with postpartum depression. I never seem really happy anymore. Even now, visiting home, I am still sad and still mystified by the sheer amount of work that goes into having 2 small children. I mourn the loss of the body I once had. I feel myself slipping away as adult conversation is replaced by talking about colors and numbers. How can I both love and resent motherhood simultaneously? I feel so weighed down sometimes by a baby who is rarely happy. I hate to see the hurt in Aurora's eyes when she wants to be held too, but the baby gets to stay in my arms because she needs me more. I feel trapped because getting out of the house is so impossible. I am on a perpetual nursing clock. I get tired of swimming the emotional highs and lows of each day as I get sweet kisses from my girls, but then stay up all night with insomnia or a fussy baby. I hate feeling like I am in a valley of motherhood, like I am just trying to survive the day. I pray you girls can't tell when I don't particularly want to read that book for the 30th time in a row, or when I don't want to nurse again when I just finished 30 minutes ago. I know this is just a season, and one day I will look back at pictures from this time and feel really silly for resenting wearing my hair up every day for months. It looks like it is going to be a long and lonely winter. I am praying for healing and for manna from heaven to get me through each day with as much love, joy, and hope as possible. I want you girls to know you are loved deeply, even when I have sad days. Your hugs and smiles keep me going. Love, Mommy." And then one other entry from that time. "Dear girls, postpartum depression is so cruel. Last night, Iris stayed awake until 3:30 a.m. and only slept for an hour before waking again. All during this time, I had to fight off anger and terrible thoughts of just wanting to give up on the whole business of mothering. I woke up this morning in tears over my angry feelings. I actually told my sweet Iris to shut up last night. For the first time ever, I could see how some parents are driven to shake their babies. So cruel, especially when you are so little and can't help that all you want is to be held. How could I be angry at such a natural request? And yet, there I was cursing my responsibilities, feeling all my facial muscles tighten as you called out for my warmth, smell, and protection while you slept. As I held you in my arms this morning to nurse, I cried and sent up all sorts of silent apologies in my embrace, hoping you would understand and forgive me. This isn't me. I'm not mean to my children. I do not lose my temper. But last night it happened, and I'm so sorry. Mercifully, God gave me grace and lifted my mood. The huge, ugly weight felt lifted off, and life looked more cheery. I can enjoy you girls without feeling the existential weight of an endless cycle of diaper changes and fussy nights. I was glad to hold Iris and nurse 1,000 times today. I don't pretend to understand hormones, but I know they are powerful enough to turn you into your ugliest version of yourself. I hope I never see that monster come out again. As the new year approaches, I'm determined to thrive and not just survive. I love you girls so much. Please forgive my shortcomings. Love, Mommy." So looking back and reading this now, it is so painfully obvious I had postpartum depression. But again, I just attributed it to life is just hard with 2 children under 2. What do you expect? So I never sought treatment for it. On the other hand, someone with an undiagnosed anxiety disorder may suffer from frequent heart palpitations, but they could attribute that to something like stress at work or too much coffee. In fact, my husband suffered from a number of severe, unexplained mental and physical symptoms for over a year before his doctor finally figured out that the common thread among them was a severe anxiety disorder. And the other thing is, a lot of these symptoms of mental illness aren't always day in and day out. I thought for the longest time that if you had depression, that meant you were sad all day, every day. And I had breaks from my melancholy from time to time. Or if you have anxiety, that means you have to feel nervous all day, every day. And that's not true for everyone. And some of that prevents people from seeking treatment. Other times we know we're in mental distress, but we've heard horror stories about all the medications and all the things they can do to you. So you put off seeking treatment. Or perhaps you just don't want the stigma attached with having a mental illness. For all those reasons, mental illness often falls through the cracks and doesn't get treated at all. So now that we've kind of talked about some of that, I want to move on to some of the ins and outs of mental illness. Let me progress my slides here. Oh, and I just got too excited and didn't talk about that. All right, so some causes of mental illness. Now, mental illness can affect anybody at any time. I was once told that I was too pretty to have depression, and that's as ridiculous as saying you are too pretty to pay taxes, or you are too pretty to break your leg, or you're too pretty to catch the flu. Mental illness can happen to anyone at any time of life, regardless of your circumstances. And sometimes it's a situational thing. So for example, someone fighting in a war zone comes home with post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes the situation is you've lost a loved one or had a miscarriage. Again, the situation causes you to go into depression. But sometimes it's not that at all. Sometimes it's a pure chemical imbalance in the brain or some distortion in your brain activity. You can have a chemical imbalance in your brain much the way some people with diabetes have imbalances with their blood sugar. So the brain relies on a few different brain chemicals to keep your mood stable and where it ought to be. And those include serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And you need a perfect balance of those chemicals to keep your mood stable. And it's all too easy for those chemicals to become insufficient or out of proportion with each other, and you get a mood disorder. Sometimes it has to do with brain activity. In the case of anxiety, your brain is firing way too much. You're in fight or flight syndrome here, and you get too much activity. In the case of depression, you're not firing enough. So I want you to look at these two brain scans. The brain on the right, that is mostly blue, which is sort of fitting for depression, is very underactivated. You really don't see much lighting up of that brain. The brain on the left is the person who has no depression, and you can see so many more yellow and orange areas where there's brain activity. So this brain scan helps make mental illness a little bit more visible to us when it's mostly an invisible illness on the outside. You can no more tell a person with brain imbalance to snap out of it than you can tell someone with low blood sugar to just pray their way out of a low blood sugar episode. Mental illness is real and caused by physical processes. And there's no amount of yoga or mindfulness or right eating that is going to fix these problems on their own. Mental illnesses need treatment. And it is actually very common to have a mix of mental illnesses. Sometimes you have anxiety and depression together. That is actually very, very common and extremely debilitating, as you can imagine. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, falls under the category of anxiety disorders. If you have bipolar disorder, one of your extremes is depression, and the other end is mania. So you have a mix there sometimes. So I want to get into a little more detail about anxiety and depression, because those are the two most common mental illnesses that you're going to run across. In fact, anxiety accounts for about 19% of all mental illnesses, and depression accounts for about 8.4%. So those are fairly big numbers. So again, with anxiety, your body's in this fight or flight response pattern even when there's no threat around. Some different mental symptoms, we're going to break down symptoms in mental symptoms and physical symptoms. A lot of times people don't realize that a lot of these mental health disorders are not just in your head, but they're very much in your body as well. You're going to have a lot of physical symptoms to go with it. And that's another reason why they're hard to diagnose. A person may be experiencing all these unusual physical symptoms and never once thinking, hey, it's my head that's causing these things. I don't have some other strange illness. But anyway, some of the symptoms of anxiety, the mental ones, include persistent worrying or anxiety about a number of areas that are out of proportion to the actual event. So for example, I'm here speaking to you, and I had some normal anxiety that you get when you're about to public speak, of course, but I didn't have a panic attack or anything like that. My anxiety response was in proportion. With anxiety, you're going to have responses. This opportunity to speak might have felt more like a life or death situation. You're going to overthink your plans and solutions to all possible worst-case scenarios. You're going to have perceiving situations and events as threatening, even when they aren't. You'll have difficulty handling uncertainty, indecisiveness, and fear of making the wrong decision. I see this one a lot. In fact, I know someone who was having some extreme anxiety and needed to buy a vehicle and had the hardest time picking one. You can imagine what a big decision that is, and normally you and I could do that, but with anxiety it becomes just almost impossible because you think every decision is going to be the wrong decision. You'll have an inability to set aside or let go of a worry, inability to relax, feeling restless and feeling keyed up and on edge. So my husband, the minister here, Caleb, actually has a pretty severe anxiety disorder that he's been dealing with for, goodness, over a decade now. And when his flares up, he cannot sit still. In fact, sometimes I joke that we get a lot done around the house when he has anxiety because he'll be cleaning out the garage, he'll be tidying up stuff he never does in his right mind. So he's a great husband, just not tidy. He leaves snail trails everywhere he goes. Anyway, so yeah, you'll feel like you just cannot sit still and relax. You'll have difficulty concentrating or feeling that your mind goes blank. You'll have constant replay of conversations with others and worry that you have somehow offended them. We have a very sweet lady at the church we worked with last. Just the simplest things, like we had March Madness recently, and she commented on Facebook about the team she was rooting for. Not even really sports banter, just more like, go team. And then later my husband gets a text from her saying, I'm so sorry, I commented on the Facebook. I should have left well enough alone. I hope I didn't offend anybody. Just very out of proportion to the situation, but it was clearly on her mind. She'd written like a whole paragraph apology for rooting for her own team, and not even in a bantering way. But she suffers from anxiety too and is just constantly worried she's offended someone. You might have racing thoughts or perseverant thoughts. Perseverant is just a fancy word for they're persistent. They won't go away. The thoughts are very intrusive. Or a general sense that something bad is going to happen. And those are just some mental symptoms. Sometimes you can have physical symptoms with anxiety. I think I can click my slide. There we go. I'm starting to regret my slides. I feel like they're throwing off my groove. But anyway, so you can have physical symptoms with anxiety. And with anxiety, you can experience just the physical symptoms and none of the mental ones, or vice versa, or a mix of all of them. But some of the physical symptoms of anxiety include fatigue, trouble sleeping, lightness in the limbs, so you feel like your body feels too light. You might get panic attacks, which makes you feel like you're dying or having a heart attack. It's a state of extreme distress. You can have dizziness or sweating. You can have trembling or feeling twitchy, nervousness or being easily startled, nausea, diarrhea, or irritable bowel syndrome. If you've ever been nervous for something, you've felt your stomach churn. Well, with anxiety disorder, that stomach churning can be an all-the-time thing. And you can also have irritability. As I mentioned, my husband has dealt with anxiety to a lesser or greater degree for over a decade. And if this is a topic that is close to your heart and you want someone to talk with about that, Caleb would be more than happy to talk to you about anxiety disorders and what has helped him over the years. He's a very good listener. So on the other side of the serotonin deficient coin is depression. And this is the topic that I can speak more to about because it's the one that I have suffered with myself. Depression wears many hats and can look many different ways depending on the person, the day, and the individual sufferer. Some of the symptoms include a persistent feeling of sadness or loss of interest. We've all felt blue from time to time, maybe especially around your periods, but with depression, the blueness just never goes away. It's extremely persistent, and you don't even know why. Everything in your life could be going really well, but you just feel sad all the time. And loss of interest is huge. I used to play piano quite a lot, which I've gotten back into. I used to read books, watch movies, and with depression, all of that goes away. You just don't care or have interest in any of it anymore. You might have tearfulness or emptiness or hopelessness. I used to joke that I would cry the way some people would get hiccups. They would just come for no reason at all, and I'd just burst into tears, and nothing would trigger it, nothing would be wrong, but I just had to cry for a while. I got very good at crying. I used to joke that I would have been a very good professional wailer back when that was an actual job description. It's like, if I could just get paid to cry, I'd be making some really good money here. That emptiness is huge. I remember feeling like my whole personality had just come and been erased. There was just nothing left of me that I felt like I could recognize anymore. And the hopelessness, the longer your mental illness goes on, the more you feel like, I'm just never going to get over it. You start to lose hope that you're going to feel like yourself ever again. You might have angry outbursts, irritability, or frustration. Some of that irritability comes because when you have depression, your senses are very heightened. All the noises feel loud and startling to you. You may not want to be touched because it's uncomfortable. So every little thing is grating to you when you have depression. You'll have a loss of interest and pleasure in most all normal activities, including sex, hobbies, or sports. You'll have sleep disturbances, including insomnia or sleeping too much. I tell myself that my superpower is sleeping. I can go to sleep at a dime, and to this day, I still go to bed by 9 or 9:30. Even though I'm feeling a lot better, I still feel the need to sleep a whole lot more than would normally be. You might have reduced appetite and weight loss, or on the other hand, increased cravings for foods and weight gain. I've done both ends of the spectrum. This time last year, I was a little on the thin side because I just didn't have any interest in eating. This time this year, I'm the heaviest I've ever been because one of my medications has made me gain a ton of weight. So I've been on both ends of the spectrum. I gotta say, I like the thin end better if I had to pick. You might have slowed thinking, speaking, or body movements. I had a special symptom of my depression called psychomotor retardation, which is a fancy way of saying your brain and your body are moving much more slowly than they should. So I sounded like I had had a stroke. My speaking was extremely slowed, very measured. I wasn't able to move or talk at a normal speed. And it was extremely obvious that something was very wrong with me. You might have trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, and remembering things. I don't remember much of anything from the year 2020. I think my brain gave me one of those amnesias to protect itself from pain, but I don't remember big events. My sister got married that year, and I was the maid of honor. And the only reason I remember it at all is because we have home video, and I wrote about it in my journal. You might have frequent or recurring thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, or suicide. I've been very blessed not to have actually attempted suicide, but I can tell you that there have been many, many times where I wish that God would take my life and let the suffering be over. You might have unexplained physical problems like back pains and headaches. So as you can see, mental illness leaves really no aspect of your life untouched. It can have a lot of unexpected negative consequences as well. So some of those things can include a loss of work. So my husband, when he was having his severe anxiety problems, he had to drop out of college for 2 full years because he couldn't function. And he was thankfully able to recover and get back to a place of health and finish his degree, but he had to take 2 years off. As my mom mentioned in the introduction, I'm a speech-language pathologist by training, and I used to work in a hospital where I did very well. But when my depression hit so hard that I couldn't talk or take care of myself, I had to quit my job. And to this day, I have yet to resume any kind of full-time or even part-time work in my actual field. You can have very damaged relationships. Mental illness is extremely difficult on a marriage. Suddenly, the well person has to take up all the slack that the sick person is left behind. And actually, there's a lot of statistics that show that if you have bipolar disorder, the rate of divorce is something like 60 to 70%. It is really, really high because it's just so hard on the marriage. My husband has told me more than once while I've had depression that I'm nothing like the wife that he married. And he didn't mean that in a bad way. He's just saying, I'm having to get used to this new you because you're not the same kind of person you were. It affected my relationships with my children. I was an empty shell of a human for an awfully long time, and I was trying to homeschool at the time. I did very minimal at that. There were lots of days when I couldn't tuck my children into bed or even play with them at all, and it made me feel like the worst mother in the world because I felt like I was negligent with my kids. And one of the cruelest things that depression can do is rob you of your inability to give and receive love. Normally, when you're around people that you care about and you hug them, you get a chemical response of oxytocin, the love hormone. It's a comfort chemical, and you get a kind of a rush of happiness when your children give you a big hug or a kiss. With depression, you can't feel that. So depression has robbed me of many of the joys of motherhood. To this day, even when I'm feeling much better, you're seeing me in really good shape, by the way. I still don't get that rush of happiness when I hug my kids that you expect to have. And when I've had depressive episodes, there have been loads of times where my mom has called and is like, have I upset you in any way? You don't seem good. And I'd be very cold and distant because I couldn't give or receive love. And of course she hadn't offended me, but I was putting up that front of being very cold and distant. So it can rob you of your relationships. Your friendships will be affected. You're not going to want to go to social events. You might ghost people and not text back. Your depressed friend may find it very hard to answer a phone call. So even your friendships can be affected. Some people with mental illness engage in very risky behaviors as well. So some of those, the reason is that you can feel very, very numb from a mental illness where you just can't feel anything. So you get to a place where you would do anything to feel anything. And some of those include taking alcohol or drugs as a way to sort of self-medicate. You may become an impulse spender. The retail therapy is real. We like getting the packages in the mail, don't we? But that can go to an extreme where it's financially difficult for your family. You can engage in adrenaline sports or gambling or body modification. Any number of those risky behaviors can be associated with mental illness. You might have medication misuse. Medication is a beautiful thing and very necessary for mental health, but sometimes with mental illness you find that you are tempted to take too much. You think if a little does me good, maybe a lot will do me a lot good, and that is just simply not how those medications work. Or on the other hand, you may take the medication only inconsistently, because sometimes the medicine makes you feel worse than the actual disorder. So medication misuse can be a huge problem with mental illness. As I mentioned earlier, you can have weight gain or loss. I have done both. I'd rather be thin if I had my choice. You can have changes of personality. I've been told by a lot of people that I am not the same person I was 10 years ago, and I totally believe that. And on the contrast, as I have gotten better, people are saying, hey, you seem like the old you. I'm remembering now what you used to be like, which is a really good sign. We're thankful for that. But you'll have changes in personality. One of the big symptoms of mental health is that you can lose your faith. I struggled with this at different points. Sometimes my faith would feel strong and I was clinging to God during these dark moments. But I'm not going to lie, there were times where I was very bitter towards God and very angry. I suffered a miscarriage last year on top of having depression, and I was very bitter towards God, very angry towards God that He would let that happen on top of the depression as well. It was just the last thing I could have possibly needed. And there have been times where my mom has recognized, like, your faith doesn't seem very strong right now. You know, and I just had felt kind of abandoned by God. And thankfully, I've never fully let go of my faith, but it can be a real temptation in times of extended suffering. And then, of course, suicide. As I mentioned, I've never actually attempted suicide, but there are many, many people who have. And that is one of the unintended consequences of mental illness. So as I bring this first session to a close, and I'm sorry I've run over time, I'll give you some time back with some of the other sessions, I promise. I wanted to read a couple of my journal entries from this time during depression. This was my journal during some of the worst of it. I used a typewriter to type them out, and I just wanted to read to you some of my thoughts during those times, because I can read statistics to you all day long, but I want to make it real for you what it's like to be that person who suffers from mental illness. Okay, and these are all from the year 2020. May 2nd. I'm starting to wonder if I will ever fully recover from depression. I continue to spiral downhill with a migraine a couple days ago. And then yesterday, I was balled up on the couch, crying and twitching. I am so sensitive to sound right now. My ears have their volume turned up to twice as loud for every little sound. I don't want to be touched or held or climbed on. I want to shrink down and disappear so small that I am invisible. And time can stand entirely still until I feel well enough to regrow into my normal size. My soul is floundering around for something, anything to make me happier. Caffeine, mail, thinking of visiting home, reading my Bible, endless home improvement, and the relief is so very temporary. I am restless, agitated, discontent, and numb. My skin feels like it is crawling, and my body is in physical pain from being so distressed. The more I learn about depression, the more I realize how long I've been struggling with it. Depression can come slowly and stealthily. For example, I used to really love music and playing the piano. I was in a band once. Now, over the last several years, I've hardly listened to any music. Most of it is too loud and jarring. I almost never play piano after having done 10 years of lessons. I used to dance a lot. I wouldn't even think about doing that now. So many interests I've lost to depression without even realizing it. Am I remotely the same person I was 10 years ago? Are the core elements of my personality still in there in any degree? In this long recovery, I'm going to have to get reacquainted with myself, to try and gradually wake up parts of me that have been asleep for years. My biggest fear now is that depression is a demon I will have to fight against my whole life. I sincerely hope this isn't the case. I love you girls more than anything, and I'm fighting this battle for you as much as for me. Love, Mommy. August 24th. I feel like my soul is rotting. Is that even possible? For the bits and pieces of yourself to slowly slough away until there's almost nothing left? I'm trying so hard to hold on to the bits of myself that I can remember, but even the core of my being is slipping away like sand running through my fingers. I'm trying to take care of my family in the only way I know how right now, helping things around the house be beautiful, since I feel like my very presence is ugly. I'm living a half-life. I'm haunting my own house with tears and twitching and many worried glances thrown my way. I take the meds, get in the sun, strap on the roller skates, obsess over home projects, pray, and beg God to take it away, but nothing. Months later, I'm still slipping away. I can feel the depression gaining ground in my life more and more. I'm so weary of crying about nothing, of never knowing how I will feel from day to day, or even hour to hour. My teeth are sore from all the gritting. My dreams are haunted. I feel truly crazy. I'm ready for this chapter of my life to be over and to get to a better time. Instead, I have to gear up for another day of battle, another day of fighting, another day of just surviving and finding the will to live. I love you girls so much, and I'm so sorry you have to watch me struggle like this. Love, Mommy. October 24th. I know what it is like to want to die, to be hurting so much that you just want it to be over. It is so difficult to explain depression to other people, particularly because it comes in so many flavors. Yesterday, it was like someone was pushing the grief part of my brain to its utmost limit, making me feel as sad and as hopeless as possible. It physically hurts and makes my body twitch and tremble. I cried for a solid hour last night, went through 2 handkerchiefs. But then, after that storm, I started to feel a little bit better. And today has been a pretty good day. This is what healing looks like. Some good days and many bad ones. Desperately holding on to the end of your rope and then tying a knot in at the end to hang on some more. I still pray for the depression to go away, but more than anything, I'm praying for endurance to withstand the suffering. It is so unbelievably painful and crippling. Mom keeps telling me that God will use this suffering for good, and I truly believe that, but I am ready to be on the other side. Love, Mommy. And I wanted to end with a poem I wrote during a hard time called The Floor, and then this first session will be yours. The floor. For the depressed person, the floor is a homing beacon. Sometimes the bed or the couch is suitable for crying, but most often when I'm at my absolute lowest, I need the floor. I'll slump down to the kitchen floor, folded in a tight ball with my head buried in my arms. I'll go face down on the carpet and claw at its shaggy fibers. If it's really bad, the floor inside isn't good enough. I go outside and lay in the grass, begging the earth to swallow me whole. Perhaps the floor takes us back to our primitive toddler reflexes when the floor was the only appropriate place for a meltdown. Maybe I'm helping gravity by giving the tears less distance to fall. Possibly gravity is stronger on the depressed person, and the attraction to earth is simply unavoidable. The floor is the most humble, most broken, most bare place to dwell. And perhaps that is why we are encouraged to kneel when we pray, so we can approach God in humility and wait for him to bring us up. If I must be on the floor, let my tears, like those of the sinful woman, wash Jesus' feet in some way. Transform my sorrow into something beautiful and useful. After all, there are countless dirty feet to wash here on the floor. All right, so I will close with that for this first session. We will have a 10-minute break, and I've run over time, but I'll try to give you some of your time back in the second session. So we'll break for 10 minutes and then come back to talk about depression in the Bible. Are we singing, Brad? Brad, is this on? Okay, perfect. All right, ladies, I think we're going to reassemble and get going again because I have eaten into my second session already with my first one. And you know, before I came here, I was really worried I wouldn't have enough material to use up the time, but that wasn't an issue, so yay me. All right, so in the second part of the session, we want to talk about, well, I've titled this part, Clothed and in Her Right Mind, so mental illness in the Bible. All right, so we're going to look at different characters who have suffered from some sort of mental illness. So since the fall of man, the world has been cursed with many forms of brokenness, and I'm convinced that mental illness is just one of those many forms of brokenness. And the Bible is full of people who have suffered from some sort of mental illness. And we're going to look at a few of those characters this afternoon, and then see what kind of encouragement the Bible has for people like myself who suffer from mental illnesses. The first character I want to look at is Elijah. All right, so we're going to be taking ourselves to 1 Kings chapter 18 to start with, and that takes us to the scene at Mount Carmel. So we have this episode where Elijah has challenged the prophets of Baal to this competition in which both parties set up altars and then call on their gods to see which one will consume their sacrifices with fire. So as you probably know, the prophets of Baal called to their God for hours and hours and went through extreme lengths to get his attention, including harming themselves. And of course, Baal didn't answer because he's not real. And then Elijah had a turn, and not only did he call out to God, but first he wanted to make sure that the display was very powerful. So he covered his altar in a ditch full of water and then put water on top of the sacrifice. And he called to God just the once, and God, in this big way, consumed the sacrifice, the water, the stones. There was nothing left after God answered this prayer and consumed the sacrifice. So God has just shown up in a huge, magnificent way, and all the prophets of Baal have just been slaughtered. You would think that Elijah would be elated. You know, I think I would be if I saw such a spectacular answer to my prayer, and to see all these prophets slaughtered who have been, you know, all for the wrong God. But in fact, he's not. He has to run for his life, fleeing from a vengeful King Jezebel. And he journeys into the wilderness to be alone. And just after this episode, he asks God that he might die. So he's feeling suicidal just after this incredible episode at Mount Carmel. So I want to read in more detail what happens. If you have your Bibles or want to grab one from the pew, let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 19. And together we'll read verses 4 through 14. 4 through 14. 1 Kings 19, 4 through 14. And I'll read it for us. But he came and went a day's journey into the wilderness and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life. I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in it. After the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice who said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed the prophets. And I, only I, am left, and they seek to take my life away." So Elijah has to be feeling very discouraged. He expresses that he alone serves God at this time, and that even after this powerful display at Mount Carmel, the Israelites are hardly affected. The nation doesn't suddenly turn and repent to be with God. And in fact, the signs and wonders of Elijah's day were only a mere blip in the Israelites' history, with no real long-term effects on the Israelites. I believe that Elijah shows several signs of depression here. In verse 3, he leaves his servant in Beersheba and goes alone. This is kind of a sign that he's quitting his job as a prophet. He's fired his staff here. And with depression or other issues like that, you often seek isolation. You just don't want to be around people. You don't want to deal with people. And Elijah has done this. He sought solitude. And also, Elijah has death wishes. More than once, he asked God to take away his life. He's feeling very suicidal right now. Elijah finds a secluded place and sleeps. So as I mentioned before, I'm a champion sleeper, and that's because I have depression. And here it's mentioned multiple times that Elijah just sleeps under this broom tree or in this cave. So I think this is possibly another sign of depression for Elijah. He tells him that his work has been in vain. So Elijah is feeling very, very hopeless about all the things he's done and all the work that he's done. Elijah has been a prophet for God for a very long time, and he feels like none of it really mattered. And depression can give you those kinds of thoughts. Depression can make you think that what you do, your very existence, does not matter, and that you're just a waste of space. And I think Elijah is feeling that way right now. And we see that Elijah may not have been eating. When the angel comes to visit him, the first thing he does is, to touch him, but then to cook for him. When I've had depression really bad, I've had absolutely no appetite, didn't want to eat. In fact, there were times when my mom had to cook for me and then physically watch me eat it just to make sure I did get some calories. And in this instance, the angel is doing much the same thing, making sure Elijah eats and takes care of himself. Now, this is just speculation on my part, but I think Elijah may have been suffering from depression for a long time. You would think that seeing such a grand episode of God's glory at Mount Carmel would make you feel elated and make your faith feel renewed. But in this instance, he just wants to go away and die. And depression can make you have this wall between you and any kind of pleasure or any kind of excitement. Nothing really affects you anymore. You're so numb. And I just have to wonder if Elijah was feeling some of this numbness himself, if he was not more impacted by this traumatic way that God was showing himself at Mount Carmel. So what does God do about Elijah's depression? Well, first things first, he has an angel to touch him and cook for him. Depression can make you feel extremely alone, and the angel's touch was very reassuring. Notice that the angel did not try to talk to Elijah right away. So many times our temptation is to kind of bulldoze in and try to fix the person. We so desperately want to make it better that we talk ourselves into this deep hole that's not helping anyone. And the angel doesn't do that. He takes care of Elijah's physical needs first. He cooks for him, he touches him, and makes sure he ate it. And he allows Elijah to vent his feelings. Again, the angel's not talking first. He wants to hear from Elijah. He says, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah gets the chance to express how alone he feels and how ineffective he has felt as a prophet. The angel doesn't tell him that, oh, all things happen for a reason. The angel doesn't tell him to just snap out of it or to have more faith. He allows Elijah to vent those feelings, and he takes care for him. And then God takes further care of Elijah. Elijah is in need of reassurance from God. Even though he's just seen him from Mount Carmel, he just needs that reassurance that God is still with him. And so God gives him a very special encounter with him. He passes by, and he was not in the wind, not in the earthquake, and not in the fire, but he was in the small, still whisper. So many times we want God to show up in this big, dramatic way in our lives. Well, Elijah's already had that at Mount Carmel, and it didn't really affect him. What he really needed was God's whispering assurance that I am still here. I'm still in control. And that's what he got. And I think sometimes with depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses, I wanted God to show up in a really big way in my life. I wanted him to swoop in and just take it away. I cannot tell you how many times I prayed on the floor, in the grass, in my bed, just take it away. I'm done. I don't want to suffer anymore. But that's not always how God works. But God's whisper of reassurance was there. My mom and I often talk about his mercy drops that we'd see. You know, just when I'd feel really bad, my mom would be able to fly and come see me in Maryland where we used to live. One big mercy drop was our opportunity to come and move here. After years of suffering with depression, the job here at College Avenue, my actual hometown, opened up, and God allowed us to come and work here. And that's been such a huge blessing to be near family for support during these difficult times, and to get to work with my own church again and help it to grow. God's mercy drops, his low whispers, are everywhere if we will just look for them. After this incident where God passes by and is in the whisper, he gives Elijah a project. He gives him marching orders. He asks him to go anoint certain kings in the other kingdoms. And I think that's important. He gives Elijah purpose again. He gives him a job to do, something to take his mind off of this depression. And then best of all, at the end of the chapter 19, he gives Elijah a helper, someone we know will be named Elisha. Because Elijah keeps saying, I alone am left. God is making sure that Elijah is no longer feeling alone. And with depression, you so need a cheerleader in your corner. You so need someone there to be with you during these hard times so you don't feel so alone. Someone to encourage you to keep plugging along in your faith, to keep walking with God. And Elisha would be that person for Elijah. So now I want to talk about Job. Job is probably the ultimate example of someone suffering from situational depression. He has lost his livelihood, his family, and his health in 3 very swift blows all at once. He's become part of a cosmic wager between God and Satan. And the question is, will Job stay faithful if all the good things in his life are taken away? True to form, he seeks isolation. In his case, the isolation is not enough to stay in his house. He goes outside the city to the ash heap where the garbage was burned. That is how much he wants isolation. And when his friends find him there, he is sitting alone, scraping his skin with a piece of broken pottery. At this point, Job not only has death wishes, which are common for depression, but he wants to go all the way back to the day of his birth and curse that as well. So I want us to turn to Job chapter 3 to get an idea of what Job is feeling right now. So bear with me as I turn there as well. Job chapter 3. Let's read how he is feeling. He gets to vent his feelings as well. All right, he says, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived, let that day be darkness. May God not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night Let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let its hope for light, but have none. Nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept, I would have been at rest. With the kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, or filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? From my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing I fear comes upon me, what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, I am not quiet, I have no rest, but trouble comes. So we get a glimpse into how Job is suffering. He describes in these verses that death is the only way to rest. In fact, he describes death as a buried treasure that he's digging for, seeking for. And I have to wonder if he's in that ash heap actively digging around in there too. In Job 17, verse 15, Job says, "Where is my hope? Who will see my hope?" And in 17, verse 11, he says, "My days are past, my plans are broken off, the desires of my heart." Job is suffering from the hopelessness that depression gives. He can see no future but suffering. Pain is like that. Some people say that depression is sort of an inability to get out of the past, and that anxiety is some sort of fixation on the future. But I don't really think that's correct. In Job's case, he is stuck in one horrible present, one with no future of rest, and he's lamenting his recent past. Pain is like that. Pain narrows your vision until you can see little else but yourself. Unlike the angel in Elijah's story, Job's friends proved to be very poor comforters, but at least they allowed Job a chance to vent his feelings. And in doing so, Job asks many of the questions that sufferers with any kind of needless suffering ask. He asks, "Where is God when I am suffering? Is he silent? Does he care? Why is this happening to me? Am I being punished?" Job does not get all the answers to these questions in his story, and I certainly will never be able to explain all the ins and outs around needless suffering. But there are a few thoughts we can learn from Job's time of his suffering and his experiences. First, we learn that our response to testing matters. In the case of Job, the wager resolved decisively that the faith of a single human being counts for very much indeed. Every act of faith by every one of the people of God is like a tolling of a bell, and a faith like Job's reverberates throughout the universe. Was Job being punished? Absolutely not. And God is not going around striking people with mental illnesses as a disciplinary measure. Think back to the time when Jesus was with his disciples and they saw the man born blind. And the disciples asked, "Who sinned, him or his father?" And the answer was, "Neither, but that God may be glorified." We can learn that God can produce some good in our times of testing. Our response to trials can glorify God. I tell you this, when I see the faith of a sister who has gone through a lot of suffering and still comes to church, still glorifies God, that kind of faith resonates with me and encourages me more than anyone's faith who has really had an easy time of it. Those kinds of faith are an encouragement. And every time we come to church, every time we come together, every time we serve God, even when we're suffering, it is like an axe to the devil's face. And Job shows us this as well. So our response to trials can glorify God. And there's already some ways I can see God using my suffering for good. For one thing, I am much more empathetic to people with suffering with mental illness. Before I had it myself, I used to have about as much empathy for depression and anxiety as I did for someone suffering from a common cold. Sure, a nuisance, definitely, a sickness, sure, but I never understood the depths of suffering that could happen with mental illness and just how crippling it could be. So I am so much more empathetic now than I used to be. Also, some of my core views have been challenged. Before I had depression, I put a lot of my worth into my productivity, what I could achieve, what kinds of accolades could I get, how much could I get done around the house, how much could I get done at church, and that was really where I put my worth. I thought, if I'm not being productive, I'm not really worth anything. And with depression, it was all I could really do to breathe and stay alive. Productivity went down 100%. And so for a long time, I felt very worthless because I wasn't achieving anything anymore. And depression has challenged my view of that. Your worth does not lie in what you are able to achieve from day to day, okay? And that is something I had to learn and that depression has taught me. So it's kind of refocused some of my core values. Ultimately, times of suffering force us to answer the question, will I trust God? And will I trust in His ultimate goodness? So often we want God to fix things right now, to make things right now, because we're not very patient. But God's timeline is not the same as ours. He promises to make all things beautiful in His time, but it may not be our time, it is His time. And there are some things that just won't be corrected until the end of time. My miscarriage last year will never be made right until I see my baby again in heaven. But it will be made right in the end. I just have to trust in God's timing. So we wait. God's miracle of transforming a dark, silent Friday into Easter Sunday will someday be enlarged to a cosmic scale. So we ask the question, will we trust God? Job teaches us that at the moment when faith is hardest and least likely, that is when it is needed the most. All right, so let's take a look next. I wanted to take a look at the Garrison demoniac, which is the whole inspiration for this clothed and in her right mind, because that's how he is described as being after his encounter with Jesus. If you will, turn to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. So we're going to look at the Garrison demoniac, verses 1 through 20. I realized the Garrison demoniac didn't necessarily have a mental illness. He had a literal legion of demons, but there were lots of things about his story that really resonated with me in my own time of suffering. So let's read that together. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. And the herd, numbered about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it to the city and the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might speak with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So again, I realize this man didn't have mental illness, but we see several signs that we can relate to, especially with depression. For one thing, he was certainly isolated, which is a hallmark of depression. He was so isolated that he lived amongst the tombs with the dead. Also, he did not take care of himself. The Bible says he was a cutter, in fact. He cut himself and hurt himself. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding around the practice of cutting, and I just briefly wanted to cover that. For the longest time, I didn't understand why anyone would want to cut themselves, why self-harm would make any sense. But the trouble is, with depression and other mental health issues, you're in so much mental anguish that no one can see that you almost want the outside of your body to match, if that makes sense at all. You want some physical sign of the suffering that you're being tormented with. And for some people, it's because of the overwhelming numbness. They can't feel anything, but maybe you can feel pain. And so that becomes a way to feel alive again. So try very hard not to judge someone who has become a cutter, because it's really not something they can help or control. And in this case, the Garrison demoniac was doing that as well. So also, the man was apparently naked, because it highlights that when he sees Jesus, he becomes clothed. When you have depression, you're often, well, you don't run around naked necessarily, or I didn't anyway, but you're not dressing yourself properly. You're not taking care of yourself. You're not showering properly. And I remember lots of times praying during hard moments that, God, make me clothed and in my right mind. I didn't have a demon, but I certainly felt tormented with mental illness. It's something that makes you feel very out of control. You feel almost possessed because you're not like yourself in any way, shape, or form. And I prayed constantly that I too could be in my right mind once more. I wanted to behave again as though I was in my right mind. And I just prayed that staying at Jesus' feet would bring me to that place, as it did for the Garrison demoniac. All right, so the last person I want to look at who was a sufferer of mental illness is Jesus himself. I want to turn to Luke chapter 22, and this is his time on the Mount of Olives. Here we have an example of extreme anxiety. Extreme anxiety. So Luke 22 in the Mount of Olives. So this is Jesus praying right before he's about to be arrested, tried, and then crucified. All right, let's read through, verses 39. All right, we'll start at verse 39 and end at verse 46. Verse 39. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." He withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." So, first of all, once again we have isolation. Even though Jesus is with his disciples, he retreats a stone's throw away. At this point, he's feeling extremely anxious and wants to be alone. Next, the Bible tells us that he knelt down. I read to you a poem about being on the floor, and here we find Jesus on the floor himself, kneeling down in agony and in prayer. He became so distressed that he became sweating profusely, and his sweat became like drops of blood. This is an extreme anxiety response. And it may even be that he was having some sort of panic attack. We can't know that for sure, but he was certainly in great distress. Because we know Jesus is sinless, we can take great comfort in knowing that panic attacks, feeling anxiety, having mental illness is not a sin in and unto itself. We know that Jesus has suffered in all ways known to man, and that includes mental illness, even if it is just for this time that he had in the garden. We can also learn what to do during some of these times of mental illness. When Jesus was feeling his very most anxious, he spent that time in prayer with the Father, begging him to take that away. And he was also surrounded by his disciples, the people he loved. Yes, he retreated a stone's throw, but he kept asking his disciples to pray and watch. And we can do the same. We can have our families pray for us and watch out for us while we have mental suffering. And we too can pray to be close to the Father during these times. I want to close our session today by looking at Psalm 139, which has become one of my very favorite psalms since I've had depression. So if you'll turn to Psalm 139 with me, and we're going to read the whole thing. Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path, my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind me, before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Oh, where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the night about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. If I am awake, I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me. Lead me to the way everlasting. This psalm is full of trust in God in both times that are good and times that are suffering. This psalm answers the question decisively, does God care when I am suffering? And the answer is absolutely. The Bible says God knows when we rise and when we sit up. God knows when you cry in the shower. God knows when you hide in the bathroom because you're too anxious to be around other people. God sees when you have the knife in your hand ready to cut yourself. God sees when you cry on the phone to your mom saying you wish not to live anymore. God sees and God cares. David tells us there is nowhere that we can go that God is not with us. He says, if I'm in a place of Sheol, which is a place associated with the dead, which is exactly where I associate depression, God is with us. God is with me while I'm clawing at the grass trying to feel better. God is with me when I'm talking to you ladies about depression. God is with you when you have to watch your friends suffer and twitch and writhe in pain. God is there, and he cares about us in our suffering. My favorite part of the verse is verses 11 and 12. He says, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be as night. I have felt that way so many times. The world is bright and beautiful, but all I can see is the dark that I'm stuck in. But he says, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day. The darkness is as light with you. No matter how dark things get in your suffering with mental illness or other things, that darkness is not dark to God. God can see it clearly as he can see things in the day. And I don't get it. I don't understand why I had to suffer so much and why people around me have to suffer so much. But God knows, and He's using it for good, and He's going to turn my dark into the light of day. And this is just the first step in doing that. So on that note, I would like to close our second session. But first, we have a brief announcement about Camp Wiregrass, and then we're going to have a prayer for our brunch. We're going to break for brunch before we do our third and fourth session. So if we'll have our Camp Wiregrass announcement real quick, come on up and you can.
Big in my heart, an audience of mothers and grandmothers and aunts is a great place to mention this. Camp Wiregrass is in an area that's not very far from here. The sessions are age specific, so like third and fourth graders are together, fifth and sixth graders together, so that we can get activities that are appropriate for your child. I'll have these cards on a table out there. If you forget to get a card, then you just search Camp Wiregrass and you'll find the website for it and everything. But think about this for your children for this summer. Thank you.
And now Hannah will say a prayer for us to bless the food for our brunch, and our brunch is in the fellowship hall. So if you will just make your way over to the fellowship hall, we'll have a lovely lunch provided by our ladies here at College Avenue.
Can you hear me? Okay. Let us pray. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this beautiful day that you have blessed us with. Lord, we just thank you so much for all of the beautiful souls that are here today. We really cherish this time together as women in your church. Thank you so much for Miranda and what she means to all of us and the example that she has been and continues to be. Please bless her and her family. Lord, we ask that you please bless this wonderful food and the hands that have prepared it. We are just so grateful for all of your wonderful blessings. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
His
Yeah, that's okay. All right, we're on, I think. All right, ladies, let me welcome you back from brunch. And let's give a round of applause to the ladies that made it, because that was delicious. It was really good. All right, so for this third session, we want to focus on how we can help ourselves when we have mental illness and how we can help others when we have friends who struggle with mental illness. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask me any questions you like, and I will do my best to answer them. All right, so how to help. Mental illness is a very complicated process, and usually medication alone is not enough to treat it properly. I once heard someone called antidepressants happy pills, and I can't really think of anything further from the truth. There's some misunderstanding around medications for anxiety and depression and other issues. They don't make you happy. If they did, I would have been fixed ages ago, and everyone would be on happy pills if that was what they did. But at their best, they make you feel less sad and more functional and more normal. And finding the right medication is really not a straightforward process for most people. It's not like taking Tylenol for a headache. You know that's going to work every time. Everyone's body responds differently to these really mind-altering medications, and it can take a really long time to find the right fit. In fact, I've tried and failed about 10 different medications myself. My depression is what they like to call treatment resistant, which is another fancy word for medications don't work for you. And so I've tried about 10 different ones myself before finding a combination of, I'm on 3 different kinds of medicines in addition to some electric shock therapy type things. And that's finally worked for me, and I'm really grateful. But it's taken about 2 years to get there. And that can be true for a lot of people. And these medications that people take for mental illness have just a ton of negative side effects. Some of those can include nausea and vomiting. Sometimes it makes your suicidal thoughts worse for a while. In fact, when I would try a lot of these medications, I'd feel worse before I'd feel better. And it takes about 6 weeks before you even know if one of those is remotely working. So you have to suffer through and stick it out while you're trying these different medications. And that 6-week time frame also applies for any increases of dose that you may be trying. So they may put you on a medicine, and then 6 weeks later, maybe increase the dose if it's not working. 6 weeks later, increase some more until you've really just thoroughly tried it, and either it works or it's failed for you. So yeah, medication is not the straightforward process you would like it to be. While people are taking medications, a lot of people will need some kind of talk therapy to help them with coping strategies. And finding the right therapist isn't as straightforward as you would think it would be either. In fact, I had a couple of bad fits. One person specialized in trauma, and I didn't have any traumatic experience to speak of. She'd say, well, what about your childhood? What negative things happened to you in your childhood? And I would just tell her, I had a great golden childhood. I have no issues to complain about. Well, what about being a preacher's wife? That has to be really demanding and stressful, and people are judgmental, right? It's like, no, actually my congregation is amazing and treats me really well, and I love being a preacher's wife. So there was she kept digging for trouble that just really wasn't there. I had chemical imbalance. So in the end, she didn't really know what to do with me. Another therapist told me all I had to do was put my hand on my heart and breathe in and out, and that would fix all my problems. That didn't work. And the same therapist also told me I needed to have a lot of sex to fix my problems. I kid you not, that was her solution to depression, was to have a lot of sex. And by the way, being touched was uncomfortable for me at the time. I didn't even want my children hugging me, so that was clearly not the answer either. Now, but having the right therapist can help a lot, though. They can give you a lot of good coping strategies with getting through each day. And that's one of the things I want to do today, is give you some coping strategies, kind of as if I was your therapist today. The trouble with mental illness is it's such a chronic problem. With a cold, you can expect to get over it in 6 to 10 days. If you break your leg, you're in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks, but there's an end point to the suffering. You can almost tick off the days until you're feeling better. Mental illness isn't like that. You never know if the next medication is going to be the one that fixes you, or if it's a problem you're going to deal with your entire life. So it's extremely chronic in nature. And yes, you do get better at fighting it, and you get a little more used to the symptoms as they come, but they don't get any less painful. In fact, the longer my depression has gone on, almost the more discouraged I've gotten, because it feels like Well, I've failed so many medications. Is nothing going to work for me? Am I going to deal with this depression my whole life? So chronic in nature is really hard. Even something like a mild mental illness can really wear on a person. Just picture holding a jug of milk at arm's length, and picture that jug of milk as being your mental illness. You can hold it up here for a while, but what happens? Your arms eventually start to shake, and it gets heavier and heavier. The weight hasn't changed, but it feels heavy because you've held it for such a long time, until your arms slowly start to drop and drop and drop until you just can't hold it anymore. And that's what happens. You drop it and you have a severe depressive episode or anxiety episode, and you just almost have that breakdown because you've been strong for so long. And that is what it's like to have a chronic illness, like mental health problems. So what have I learned over the last 2 years that has helped me get through depression? So first we're going to focus on things you can do if you are the one suffering from mental illness. First, I have learned that it is really important to keep your world small. With any mental illness, day-to-day activities can feel way harder than they should. It feels like trying to go around and do your house tasks, but with 50-pound ankle weights on your ankles. Everything just feels more difficult. Tasks can feel overwhelming, and suddenly you get really behind, and you can get so far behind that you don't even know where to start anymore. And this is especially true with housework. The house can get out of hand in a hurry. So keep your world small. Minimize your social calendar as much as you can. Now, I'm not telling you to be a recluse because that's not helpful, but if you're gonna pick and choose, pick things to go to like church, but maybe skip out on watching someone's softball game. You know you only have so much mental reserves, so you wanna be choosy in what you pick. So minimize your social calendar, especially when you're having a hard time. If you can, delegate housework out. My husband was really, really tremendous in that he took over all the food responsibilities at my house. There was a time when grocery shopping felt impossible. I could not find the will to cook for my family, let alone eat myself. So my husband was really awesome to take over all the grocery shopping, all the meal planning, and all the cooking. And that alone was just a tremendous burden relieved from me. And he still does most of that to this day, and it's been a humongous help. So my girls have also learned how to clean up their own rooms and the playroom, and I tell you, that is a skill I still very much value even while I'm feeling better. If you happen to have a good day, try to spend the energy you have organizing and purging your home. If you have less things in your house, it'll be less things for you to clean and take care of. So spend that energy wisely. If your house is ordered to any degree, you will find that it relieves some of your mental load as well. So have good organization. Also, keep your goals for the day small. If you know you're having a rough time, don't set yourself up with an impossible to-do list. You'll just feel like you have failed the entire day. Sometimes it's enough to just make the bed, get a shower, and do one load of laundry. And on a bad day, even that may feel like a huge ask. So again, in all things, keep your world as small as you can. Secondly, I've learned to make my bed. I know that sounds like a very small task, but it can be very helpful. With many mental illnesses, the temptation can be to stay in bed all day, and I've certainly done that. Some days it's all you can do just to breathe in and out and stay alive, and the bed is an excellent place to do that. The bed is not judgmental, it is very comfortable, it's not demanding, but it doesn't really inspire a fighting mindset. So even on days when I knew, because I would wake up and you can kind of tell what your day is going to be like when you've had mental health trouble for a while. So even when I'd wake up and could tell it was going to be a bad day, I tried really hard to make my bed. And that one small accomplishment sometimes helped me accomplish other small things too. You need that small win for your day to help you feel better. And sometimes I found that after making the bed, I really didn't want to get back in it quite so much as I thought. So it helped me to have a fighting mindset. Next, it is important to get yourself ready for the day. This is a hard ask when you feel really crappy about yourself, but it is terrible for your mental health to look as bad as you feel, okay? So do the best you can to get up, brush your teeth, brush your hair. Those basic, simple things that'll show that you're taking care of yourself. Get a shower. Shower sitting down if you don't have the energy to shower standing up. Also, shower, excellent place to cry if you need to do that. You're already wet. So get yourself ready for the day. Now, I didn't always achieve this goal but I at least try to put on clean pajamas, if nothing else, or find some clothes that are regular clothes but are comfortable. In fact, cozy clothing is an excellent gift for your friends with mental health or disorders. Get them a great sweatshirt, a good robe, a good pair of slippers. They will be so grateful, because that'll help them to feel more comfortable during this really bad time. I was gifted a sweatshirt, and I practically lived in it there for a while, and it was great. So, and that's not to say you have to get gussied up for the day when you feel terrible, but I found for me, putting on real clothes helped. I did a reduced version of my makeup routine. I found if I didn't do any, the ugliness on the outside seemed to match the ugliness on the inside, and that was not good for me. And I really like jewelry, so even if I was in my pajamas, I might put on some earrings, just anything to surround myself with a little bit of beauty. And that helps inspire a fighting mindset. Sometimes seeing myself put together in the mirror inspired me to fight a little harder that day. If you're just in your pajamas all day, it's almost like you're saying you've given up for that day. And some days, there are days you'll have to do that. There are days you'll be in pajamas all day. But change the pajamas, get some clean ones. Give yourself a fighting start. So my next bit of advice is to get outside and get moving, okay? If you happen to be depressed or anxious on a nice day, get yourself outside. You can set up a blanket in the shade if it's hot, or in the sun if it's mild. This used to really help me with some of my numbness. Depression made me feel incredibly frozen in all respects of the word. I had trouble moving, I had trouble talking. My emotions felt completely frozen. And something about being in the sun for a long time helped me get a feeling of being thawed out a little bit. And there's a lot of good studies about, they call it nature bathing, where you get outside and take a walk in nature, or just sitting outside, and how that can help with your endorphins, and just getting sunshine, vitamin D. I know it's very cliche to say get outside when you feel bad, but it really does help you, and anything that can help is certainly welcome. Now, and it gives you a small sense of accomplishment, kind of like when you're sick and you finally move to the couch, and you feel like, hey, I've graduated to the couch. With mental illness, going from bed to being outside can feel like a small sense of accomplishment, a small graduation. It can make you feel like you've been productive. So get outside. The next one is a much harder ask, get moving. So I know no one wants to hear me stand up here and say exercise, and I'm not going to try and tell you to exercise a lot so much as to make sure your body is moving to some degree. I think I mentioned already I had psychomotor retardation, where I got fairly catatonic. I couldn't move or talk. And on some of those days, my mom would take me by the hand and kind of lead me around our neighborhood. It was a slow as a snail kind of walk, but something about it helped me to kind of free up my nerves again a little bit. I felt like I was able to talk a little bit by the end of one of those walks. I felt like I could cry a little bit more, which crying is really an important part of healing. Never be afraid to let the tears come, because they really do help your body to feel better. So get outside. If you're anxious, you often have kind of an excess of nervous energy, and a good workout can really help relieve some of that as well. So any kind of movement you can get, whether that's walking back and forth in your hallway on a bad day, or taking a very slow walk around your neighborhood on a good day, it'll only do you good if you're really struggling with your mental health that day. My next bit of advice is not on the board, but it is to find projects to do. When I was doing really poorly, I took up knitting. So I'm no great knitter. I can't do anything other than a square and a rectangle, but I'm very proud of those accomplishments. Thank you very much. But it was great to keep my hands busy, because your head gets into such a negative thought spiral. And I told you already, I put a lot of worth into my productivity, and I still do to this day, even though that's a value that I've changed on the whole. But knitting felt like I was accomplishing something when I couldn't do anything else. I could sit in the bed and knit. I could rock in my rocking chair and knit. Also like refinishing antique furniture. I could cry while I sanded away at wood. And something about that was very therapeutic. It got my body moving a little bit. It kept my hands moving. It gave me a much needed distraction. And it's a hobby, you know, it helps you to re-engage with the world a little bit. So find a project you can do. Some people like to do coloring books, and that helps them a lot with their anxiety or depression. Or put together a jigsaw puzzle. None of these things are very demanding, but it gives you a sense of accomplishment, something to do, something to take your mind off it. Next, I would like to say, hold on to your faith. When you're suffering, your faith is going to be tried and tested, and there will be times when you want to let it go entirely. There will be times when your trust in God is really shaken. But do what you can to stay connected to God. Even when it's hard, still pray to God. A lot of my prayers during this time were only a couple of words. Please make it go away. Please make it go away. Or end the suffering, or why God? I prayed a lot, why God, why? And it's okay if your prayers are short. It's okay if your prayers are questioning, but still pray. If you're up to it, and I know with mental health it can be very hard to concentrate, do read the Bible, little snippets at a time. I have found the Psalms to be a very good place to read because David felt the entire range of emotions that a human can have. And as we read in Psalm 139, he had times when he felt like he was in Sheol, or that his life was in danger, or that he felt very depressed. And so I've been able to really connect with the Psalms in a way I haven't been able to before. So as much as you can, keep up with your faith and keep going to church. And that's one of the hardest things of all. When you have poor mental health, going to church can be one of the last things you want to do. With depression, I didn't want to get dressed properly for church. And more importantly, I didn't want anyone to see me like that. It's not cool for people to see you crying in the pew, but I've done it. There have been times where I've had to cry in my husband's office because I couldn't stop, but you still come to church anyway as much as you can. I just didn't want people to see me not talking, not functioning. It's embarrassing to a degree, and I know it shouldn't be, and I know church is a place for broken people too, but that's so much easier said than done. When you yourself are the broken one, it can be very, very hard to come to church. But that's exactly what Satan wants us to do, isn't it? He wants you to stay at home. He wants you not to be an encouragement to other people. He wants it to isolate you where other people can't be an encouragement to you either. So as hard as it may seem, and there have certainly been times where I've stayed home, try to come to church, even if it means crying in the pew, even if it means having to leave for a minute to gather yourself and your wits together, even if it means letting other people see your brokenness, still come. People respect a faith like that. Even you coming in your brokenness is an encouragement to other people. They see that a church is a place for broken people, and of all places, the church should be a place where you feel safe to be your broken self. And it's where other people can encourage you. And every time you come, it is a smack to Satan's face. He wants you to stay home, but you didn't do it. So try your best to stay connected to your faith when you're going through these difficult times. My next advice is to don't stay alone. You want to seek isolation when you have depression and anxiety. You don't want people to see you like that. But it is so bad for your mental health to completely withdraw from society of any kind. You need people who can be cheerleaders for you. In my case, my husband and my mom were the two people that I would let see me at my lowest. They were the ones who would sit by the bed, hold my hand, give me handkerchiefs, force me to eat, force me to walk around the neighborhood. You need those people in your life, and you need to let them in so they can help you in any way that they can. They need to help you look after yourself when you can't. And most importantly, if you feel remotely suicidal, do not stay alone. Do not stay alone. And if you can't have someone with you, call someone on the phone to talk with you, whether that's family, friends, or even the suicide hotline. Don't be alone when you feel that way, because it's too easy to let your negative thoughts get to you and convince you that you don't want to live anymore, when that's just not true. I also suggest keeping a journal. I've brought mine with me today, or at least one of them. I've got several. This is the one that I wrote about when I was at my very worst places, and journaling was a very healing thing for me. I found talking out loud extremely difficult when my depression was at its worst. Talking and forming the words just felt like carrying something very heavy, and I just wasn't able to do it. But I could write. So I would write all the words that I couldn't say. And writing, your journal's not going to judge you. It's not going to judge any negative thoughts. You're not going to hurt anyone else by writing even the darkest things you may be thinking. And sometimes writing about something can help you draw out the poison that you have in your life. And once you've written about it, you don't have to think about it so much. And on a practical benefit, my journal became a great memory aid for me. I have very few memories from the year 2020 but I wrote a lot that year. So I can look back and see my progress. You know, sometimes it feels like progress is really, really slow and you feel like you're not getting better. But when I read back through my journal entries from this time, I'm miles away from where I was sitting in my rocking chair, staring into space, just crying. I've come a million miles already, and I can see that because of my journal. And I can look back and see that there were good things that happened in my life too. I can remember some of the cute things my kids did because I wrote about it. I can remember my sister's wedding because I wrote about it, whereas otherwise I'd have no memories of that year at all. So journaling can be a very practical thing for you too. So these have all been tips for someone dealing with depression or anxiety themselves, but what if you're the friend or the family member who wants to help? So let's look at some strategies for how to help others who have depression, anxiety, or other problems. First of all, the best thing you can do is to pray for them. And I know that sounds obvious, but a person with mental illness is very likely being spiritually attacked in addition to everything else. And we need to pray very hard and very specifically that the suffering will be used for good, that Satan will not destroy their faith, that the right medications will be found, that the right therapists will be found, and that that person will remember their reasons for living. And it's important to let the person know you are praying for them. Just knowing I had a field of people praying for me helped me feel stronger. If you just keep that to yourself, it certainly does good because God hears it, but the person you're praying for needs to know about it too. Let them know you're praying for them. Sometimes it's appropriate to pray over the person right there with you. I've had my husband pray over me lots of times, and that's given me strength to carry on. Next, I would say offer to help around the house. I mentioned before in the Keep Your World small tip that an ordered home can help the person with mental illness feel like things are a little more in control. And it can be really hard to keep your home in order when you have mental illness. Now, when I say offer to help around the house, what I really mean is say, I'm coming over. Because the person with mental illness, if you ask them, what can I do? They have a really hard time directing their own steps. My mom learned really quickly that my standard answer to what can I do was, I don't know, you don't have to do anything, don't worry about it. You know, I'd just shrug all of those things off. When I desperately needed help, I just didn't know how to ask, or I felt embarrassed because, well, I should be doing my own laundry. I'm a grown woman, I can do my own laundry, except that you can't when you're having mental health troubles. So you need to say, I'm coming over, what time works for you? Or maybe just show up is even better. Show up and come in and just look for what needs doing. It may be dishes, it may be laundry. You need to be formidably nice because that person is going to just turn away your offers to help when that's exactly what they need more than anything. I've had my mom come in and reorganize my kids' clothes because they just shoved their clothes in whatever drawer and there's no rhyme or reason. I've had my mother-in-law come and help me take care of the kids when I couldn't do it myself. If there are kids in the picture, helping with them can be a tremendous relief to the person suffering with mental illness. It is really hard to feel like you're not the mother you want to be. And it is really hard on the kids to see their parent crying or non-functional or not playing with them like they're used to. So if you can help distract the kids in some way or meet some of their needs, like cooking them a meal or giving them a bath or taking them to the park, that's a huge load off that mother who's suffering from depression because she knows at least her kids are being looked after. That's one of the best things you can do if there are kids in the picture is help them with them. Next tip is to take care of that person's physical needs. In the depths of depression or other mental illnesses, you're probably not taking care of yourself. You're probably not eating. You may not be brushing your teeth or your hair. You may not be getting dressed for the day. All of those things kind of go by the wayside when you're in that much pain. And when you're the friend that comes over to help, you can help meet some of those physical needs. Something as simple as brushing your friend's hair can go a long way. It keeps it from getting tangled and matted, and the person with depression knows that you care. Ask if they've been in a shower, and if not, offer to take care of the kids so they can do that. Cook them a meal, especially if you know they're not eating properly right now, and watch and make sure they eat it so they get some calories. Take them to their psychiatric appointments. There was a time when I really wasn't safe to drive. I was moving and talking and thinking so slowly that my reaction times were not adequate for driving. So I'd have my mom or my dad or my husband's, anybody would drive me to my psychiatric appointments. In extreme cases, you may need to urge them to go to the psychiatric hospital or take them there yourself. You need to be that person who does that. If the person is suicidal, you can help by locking away all their medications, lock away any kind of objects like knives that they can hurt themselves with, and keep eyeballs on them. Sometimes a person needs that kind of suicide watch if they don't want to go to the hospital necessarily. I've been put on that protocol before where I've had medications locked away and my family would dispense them properly, so it's just practical so someone doesn't overdose or hurt themselves. You can help in that way, especially if you're willing to watch the suffering. Pay attention to the person's communications, both to the words they say and to their radio silences. A lot of times a person undergoing a severe depressive episode or anxious episode will suddenly become very quiet. You won't get texts from them. They won't be posting on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. They won't call. When you hear those kind of radio silences, those are the times to check in. I used to say, and I still say, my mom has this creepy sixth sense about her. She knows exactly when I'm having a hard time, even if she hasn't seen me. And a lot of times it's because I've gone quiet. I haven't responded to texts very much. She can just tell, and she'll call, and she'll ask if I'm having a bad day. It's like, how did you know? You haven't seen me today. It's like, well, you were very quiet. So pay attention to those silences. It means something. If you hear your friend say something that feels or sniffs of suicidal thoughts, take that very seriously. They're not saying that to get attention. They're not saying that to get pity. They're saying that because they truly believe that might be the only way out of the pain and the suffering. So pay attention to those kind of comments and do what you can to remind your friend of why they have reasons to live. Sit with them during their worst moments, and this is a hard one. No one likes to be in a situation where they're surrounded by pain, but this is what your friend with depression needs the most. Someone to sit with her in her very worst moments. Someone to sit with her quietly next to the bed while she cries, or while she's twitching, or while she's non-functional, or while she's having a panic attack, or any one of those number of things. Don't be tempted to just bulldoze in and put a rosy face on it, saying it's all going to work out, things are going to be great. Just sit there and be with them. It's often been said that grief needs to be witnessed in order to be validated. And just your being there, witnessing your suffering, is a help unto itself. And it lets them know that they're not alone. If you must say something, remind that friend what they mean to you, because that friend brings things to this world that no one else can. And it's easy to forget that and to feel like you're worthless and useless and just a burden. Remind your friend that they're not any of those things. So sit with them in their pain. You can do this over the phone too. If you're long distance or just can't drop everything and go be with that person, you can certainly call and just listen quietly on the phone while your friend vents about whatever they're feeling. So be with them in their very worst moments. Just sit with them. You do not have to be a therapist. In most cases, talking hurts rather than helps. So just be with them. And one of the best things you can do is to educate yourself on the person's mental illness. Try and find out what medications they're on so you can know about side effects to look out for. Try to find out about any treatments they're going through. Like, for example, right now I'm undergoing something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a cousin to electric shock therapy, and I have to go to Dothan every single day for 36 treatments to get this done. And so if you know that about a friend and you know they're having to go to Dothan for treatments, maybe you can offer to watch the kids during those times, or pick up some other kind of slack, or offer a little gas money because you know that's getting expensive. There are lots of ways you can help if you are educated about what's going on with them. Attending events like this will help you be as supportive as possible because you now know some things you can do, and we'll talk about a few things not to do or say as well. Sometimes all your friend needs is a small, kind act, a mercy drop from God to make them feel a little bit better. Be the kind of friend that leaves flowers and coffee on the porch and then walks away, because that's just all the person needs is a kind act. Be the kind of friend that comes over to do the dishes. Be the kind of friend that leaves encouraging texts with no expectation of hearing back. And don't forget about your friend. Your friend with mental illness isn't trying to be a bad friend, isn't trying to forget about you, isn't trying not to communicate with you. They just can't right now, and they need you to be there for them more than ever. So here's a few things not to say. For one thing, don't say, it's all in your head, because it's not. As we talked about, mental illness has a lot of physical symptoms as well and can make the person feel very physically ill. And it's not something they've just imagined. I showed you a brain scan. There is actual reduced brain activity. There is actual chemical imbalance. You would never tell your diabetic friend, it's all in your head. You don't need insulin. It's all in your head. You would never say that. And so don't say it to your people with mental illness either. Don't say things could be worse. This is not helpful, for one thing, and your friend probably already feels like the worst has happened. If they're at a place where they don't want to live anymore, don't tell them things could be worse. They already feel that way, okay? Don't tell them to snap out of it. They do not choose to have mental illness, and if they could snap out of it, they absolutely would. No one wants to stay in that place willingly. Don't tell them, we all feel blues sometimes. Because mental illness is so much more than just feeling blue. It is persistent, it is constant, it is physical, it is torturous. Do not say, but you have such a great life. This may be true. You know, you can have all the blessings in the world. I certainly did. My life was going great. I had no reason to have depression triggered, but I just had severe chemical imbalance. It just happened, just like breaking your leg might just happen, and it can happen to anyone. No matter how good things are in life, no matter how many blessings you may have, you can still suffer from mental illness. So don't tell the person, you have such a great life, you shouldn't be suffering, or you're too pretty to have depression, which I've had said to me before. Don't tell them, well, you just need to be positive. You know, obviously we all want to have a fighting mindset, but if an attitude change would have fixed it, they would have fixed it already. And finally, don't tell them, well, you don't look very sick. I don't understand why you can't work or come to this social event. You don't look sick. Mental illness is very invisible, and the suffering is very much on the inside. It doesn't matter what the person looks like on the outside. The suffering is real. So this doesn't cover absolutely every way we can help, but hopefully you've gained some insights into how you can help yourself and how you can help others with mental illness. Mental illness is debilitating and complex, but everyone can help do something for those who suffer. All right, so let's just do a 5-minute break maybe, and then come back. Thank you. We'll just break for 5 minutes this time, and then we'll come back and you can ask me any questions you like about mental health, about the Bible, about my experiences, and I'll do my best to answer them. to get back started because I've already run over my allotted time, and I'm so sorry about that. Can you not hear? Can't hear me at all. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I think the mic's on. That sounds weird. Any better? No? Have you seen that? No. Sounds like it. I'll just yell. Is that okay? Totally okay. But mental health is just such a broad topic. I wanted to allow some time. So, without further ado, does anyone have anything they want to ask me?
Yeah, I do.
Yes, ma'am.
How does a psychiatrist, whether or not you have a chemical imbalance that's causing your depression, or whether or not it's a situation like those men you talked about in Texas, they were going through situations that caused their depression.
Yeah.
So how does a doctor ever figure that out?
Well, so if you didn't hear the question, it's how does a doctor know the difference between a chemical depression or a situational depression? And the answer is all depression and anxiety has a chemical imbalance component. It's just a matter of what triggered it. So they're going to be treated the same way. Situational depression or anxiety, you have something you can point to and say, aha, that was what caused my brain chemicals to tip over in a negative kind of way. With just regular chemical imbalance like I had, your chemicals went haywire and we just don't really know why. So in the long run, the brain chemicals involved are the same, whether it's situational or whether it's chemical only. You just have the luxury of pinpointing and saying, ah, that's what started me off on a bad road. But it's all the same underneath in the brain. Good question. Any other questions?
How long have you, or what age were you when this come on you?
That's a really good question. I've been officially diagnosed for 2 years, so I was 30 when I got my diagnosis. But I've been dealing with depression a lot longer than that in hindsight, now that I know what to look for. In my early 20s, mid-20s, while I was in graduate school, I had something called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, where I would get very severe depression symptoms, but only around my period. So that really started in graduate school, where I'd have depression on my period, but it would go away as soon as I'd started. So it was a monthly issue, but it was just like PMS times 10. And then after my second baby, I'm positive I had postpartum depression. But again, that was just around that postpartum period. I didn't feel like I had depression all the time. It wasn't until I was 30 that I had a true breakdown in the sense of the word and became so non-functional and it was just painfully obvious, yes, you have a problem, we need to get you treated ASAP. So yeah, 20s is when it started, but 30 was when it really got very bad. Good question. Other questions?
You said church is a place for the broken people, and it's hard when you're the broken one. I want to be part of a church that helps be that real place.
Yes.
So when you are going through those kind of, where you're crying, how can we respond? And you gave us a lot of ways to minister, but when you're, what is the best way to respond to that that's not over the top, not trying to fix it, but yet supportive during that kind of public environment?
Right, and so it's happened to me here, when I've been crying in the pew and someone notices, really the best thing you can do is just touch that person. Don't say anything, there's really nothing to say. It just hurts, it just stinks. There's nothing you can say that's gonna make it better. But touching that person, giving them a hug, quiet acknowledgement, giving them a pat. I've had Debbie Rhodes actually here has patted me on the back multiple times when I would cry because I sit in the pew in front of her. That's really the best thing you can do, or just a quiet, I'm praying for you. What you want them to know is, I see you. I see the suffering, it stinks, I acknowledge it, and we're here for you. So there's really nothing fancy that you can do, but just your presence there, just that reassuring touch, makes that person feel loved and accepted. What you don't want to do is
whoa, you're crying, I'm gonna back off from that person. Be the kind that hands the tissues over. Be the kind that gives a hug, not the kind that is too afraid to engage, okay? That's the main thing. Other questions? Well, if not, it's been an awesome Ladies' Day, and Leanne is gonna wrap us up for today with a prayer and possibly some closing remarks, I don't know. She's just gonna wrap us up.
I just want to thank you all for coming. It's always so encouraging to me to be with a group of ladies, one this big, that shares my faith and shares my love for God. So I want to thank you all for coming and for your interest in this topic. And Miranda, I want to thank you specifically for sharing your struggles with us and the experience and wisdom you gained from it. I